Hi, my name's Tony Ridley and welcome back to another Crisis Leadership and Management Education tutorial. In this section we're going to talk about warning signs and indicators. In previous sections we've spoken about the basics of crisis management, teams, stakeholders, communications, decision making. Now we're focusing specifically on the warning signs and indicators, particularly as it relates to our monitoring and surveillance of potential events, threats and hazards to us, the organisation, and the longevity of our business operations. So one of the issues with monitoring and surveillance, and certainly vigilance when it comes to crisis management, is that through sleight of hand, everyday distractions, the reality of big business and a lot of information and data, big data in particular, is that we can often be focused on the wrong thing, or we think that we're focused on a particular issue, and meanwhile, whilst we're exclusively focused and concentrated in a particular area, we are caught by surprise because we've been intently focused on a particular issue, area, or maybe even a wrong consideration. So I've reiterated many times throughout all of these educational sessions is that crisis will not announce its arrival. It will not turn up in a big brightly coloured suit with a banner with invitations sent in advance and an option for you to opt in or out. Crisis is always potentially developing. Crisis has spontaneous triggers. It has well telegraphed triggers. It has preventable, identifiable junctions, choices and decisions at many stages. Some of them are forced upon us through no fault of our own and beyond circumstances we have any control of. However, many, if not all, have signs and indicators along the way, and we need to be attuned to identifying and be prepared for these alerts and signals as they occur. Particularly when we talk about risk, the risk is a result of considered evaluations of threats and hazards. At the end of the day, we can choose to be risk adverse, we can choose to transfer risk, we can make insurance decisions, we can mitigate, or we completely avoid risk. But the variance of return is what really determines the value of an asset. Everyone talks about return on investment. Well, the reality is that anybody should be getting return on investment in a business environment, because otherwise, why did you buy it? It's a case of the variance, or maximising and optimising the variance of return. So instead of settling for a 5% return, we should be getting anywhere between 40 to 60%. So again, risk mitigation is an economic decision, and it's a preparation based on our comprehensive evaluation of the threats and the hazards. So it's the threats and hazards that we need to be prepared to have a monitoring and surveillance process in place to advise us, warn us, or at least escalate to the next level of attention. All of these need to be contextual to the business, and they need to be measured on a regular basis. There is little to no value in being concerned about the entire world's problems. If it's not relevant to your business, if it's not relevant to you withstanding market influences and macroeconomic influences, you can spend a lot of time, energy and resources chasing the wrong things, being fearful of every event known to man and more. The reality is that it should be specific elements that directly or potentially indirectly affect your organisation, and those that you've either assessed in advance or see as foreseeable considerations when it comes to threats and hazards to your organisation. When we start to look at the relationships, however, this is where we need to be both shrewd and calculated in determining how symbiotic or how direct some of these relationships actually are. Because for those things that affect upon us, I spoke about the macroeconomic issues before, but then we've got micro issues. So we need to have an understanding of the field and environment before we apply a triage or or qualification process on what are our most primary concerns. Now, again, hopefully this is already in your crisis, business resilience, business continuity planning. However, if it's not, I certainly recommend that you revise it. And certainly these things are very fluid in the sense that they are going through perpetual change and shift. There are many things that occur outside of our markets or in our industry that affect us that our plans simply don't keep pace with. So it's important that there is either someone, something, some system, or the ability to quickly review and analyse and monitor these types of influencing factors, particularly as they relate to threats and hazards, and how the eventual course of action may lead to a negative impact upon our business. Now, this is not new. This is not something extraordinary. Many, if not all, businesses in a commercial space are doing this for opportunity. They're looking at opportunity. They're mapping out the same types of realities where there's a niche in the market, where there's a weak competitor, timing, all those sorts of things are being considered from a proactive, positive perspective, but they should also equally be done on the adverse or negative space. Now, the other thing to be mindful of here, depending on the nature of your business, these could well present as a crisis, a threat, or a hazard, but they could also be identification for a commercial opportunity. They could be new markets, they could be new business products, they could be things that you can anticipate that are affecting not only you but your competitors, and therefore they require an evolutionary change in order to survive the next shift. So again, don't necessarily look at all of this as dead money or dead space or wasted time, and risk mitigation is that these can also be significant competitive advantages, not only in the anticipation, identification of threats and hazards, but your evaluation of how quickly and how prepared you can recover from such foreseeable risks is by and large a significant competitive motivator and advantage for organisations that have this right. So when we talk about risk registers, and there's all sorts of variances and frequencies and opinions and considerations, but the basic elements for organisation is to look at the qualitative and quantitative aspects within the organisation, the scheduled risks, everything from cultural to financial, as well as the organisational risks that are most frequent or most common. And remembering, be cautious of subscribing to your own popularity or your own press releases, in the sense that many organisations tend to develop a culture or a habit in terms of what they believe are the most common, when in fact, if you ask other people, or if you apply an objective view, then you'll see vastly differing opinions when it comes to the application and consideration of hazards and concerns. So just bear that in mind in terms of what that means to you and your organisation, as to whether you have basically become a crowd think and you're all assuming and thinking along the same lines. Just bear that in mind, that you haven't oversimplified the process. Now, as we start to go through the risk analysis, we then need to categorise, because at the end of the day we need to prioritise both our resources, our decision-making cycles, our considerations, and certainly our priority of efforts. So if we look at certain conditions, we look at the descriptors that make them up, we can then qualify and risk categorise them. Now, there's a whole array of mathematical calculations that need to be considered or reviewed when looking at the oversimplification of risk categories. In particular, a failing that I see in a lot of these risk registers and risk considerations is the transition between an oversimplified category that's conveniently color-coded and numbered 1 through to 5, is that what that can mean mathematically is that it's a non-linear change, which means instead of going 1 to 2 as being a natural progression, it actually indicates a 40% increase in threat. And going from a 4 to a 5 could be a 70% leap in threat. So by the time it actually changes to a new category, you've actually covered a significant amount of distance, and you've possibly amplified the risk significantly before it became a consideration. So again, just go back through and reconsider how you've come to a number of those conclusions, because time and time again, it's not the inability to monitor and watch for signs and indicators, it's often the fundamental systems that were derived in the first place, and as a result it catches a lot of people out, or all it does is just confirm that it is a 100% crisis, because your tools have constructed it in such a manner that you're only alerted when it's critical. Countermeasures in place, who's responsible, and times and dates. So again, this comes down to the availability of resources, it comes down to attentions, priorities, but risk registers and risk analysis is not something that should be done on an annual basis, nor a biannual basis. As I said earlier, there's a lot of market influences, there's a lot of dynamic aspects, the evolution of change, competitive landscapes and so on is such that there is no fixed timeline of when you should be reviewing this or when you should be looking at it, but it certainly doesn't fall into calendars. It's not something that you can schedule. It depends on the requirement. If there's been a major change in your industry or a major event that's reshaped your thinking or a potential foreseeable risk, then it's time to go through a change management system, and that could be 2 weeks since you did it last. All of these things need to be reconsidered, as well as in the event or the back end of post-recovery from a crisis, it's now time to reevaluate your understanding of threats and hazards in the event of a number of incidents. Now, this is not just incidents, but the potential or the near miss. Again, a lot of these incidents, when you reverse engineer them, they were apparent and they were frequent. They were just never reported. There was no mechanism in place for them to get to the final destination that makes it onto one of these registers or onto the report. So you actually find a history of multiple events and multiple circumstances that did not have catastrophic outcomes. However, they were so insignificant that they simply weren't reported, or nobody identified them as having the potential to lead to a catastrophic event. And the possibility and probability, and again, there's all sorts of mathematical equations depending on whether you're in finance, oil and gas, consulting, retail, manufacturing, transport, and so on. There's all sorts of variations in systems, but essentially basic word quality processes that identify indicators and impacts, what preventative and corrective measures you have in place, and then some sort of numerical value at the end of it. Now, the reason I emphasize numerical is it's the most universal means of quickly communicating information and priority to a group of individuals. Now, it's not for the sake of oversimplification. Color-coded charts and the dumbing down of information is not what I'm talking about, but using numerical values, however the calculation, remembering caution on the black box calculations, it's an expedient way to transfer information. So if people can readily see that it's a 20% priority, it's an 80% priority, without all of the rest of the word pictures and so on, it communicates the gravity and impetuousness that is required when dealing, managing and reporting with this particular issue. It helps very quickly cut through what could be mountains of information and huge volumes of words available if you can break it down into a very descript numerical value, however you come to that value. So at the end of the day, when we're talking about crisis management, you should have a ready reckoning tool. What is nil to major to significant that affects your key asset-driven categories, people, finance, market, facilities, products, processes, and so on. And there should be dedicated thresholds, pain tolerances. So if anything above $50,000 is considered a major event, then it should be clear to all, because remembering, as I've said time and time again, is you're not going to be able to telegraph and script every type of scenario, or countermeasure for that matter. So the reality is that you need to have some sort of understanding as to what the group or the organisation's pain tolerance or pain threshold or risk appetite is in simple terms. If it's the injury of 4 people, is that a catastrophic? What constitutes a stoppage? What is negligible? Because otherwise it's open to interpretation. It needs to be clear, it needs to be concise, and it should be something that can be boiled down to something as simple as a basic matrix for communication and clarity. So the final stage, when we're talking about the escalation of events, the reporting, is I'm a firm believer in the rapid escalation of information, at least reporting and communicating and engaging, and the gradual de-escalation. It's far better to be over-prepared. It is always a fine line of crying wolf in terms of talking scarcity and raising an issue and hitting the panic button 5 times a week. But it should be a gradual de-escalation. Until proven otherwise, they should be treated as significant threats and hazards, and this should also be documented and supporting evidence. And this plays into the performance metrics, is reporting and consolidating all of these systems, and it's becoming an even easier and more accessible for organisations to rationalise and simplify all of these systems. So ensure that whatever mechanism you have in place is accessible to frontline, back office, shared resources. Everybody can contribute to the process. It's not overly laborious, time wasting, frustrating, because all of these little data points are going to help. So when in doubt, escalate, communicate, raise it with somebody, and let the system and the methodology start to objectively look at the considerations and the circumstances in which you've raised. And then if your system works and you have all of the other mechanisms in place and supporting elements, then an objective assessment will be made as to the severity of a particular crisis and the appropriate action that needs to take place. And certainly whether it even requires the mobilisation, activation of crisis teams, recovery teams, and so on. So that essentially covers the warning indicators. For more information on this for crisis leadership and education, please visit the website at www.crisismanagement.tony-ridley.com. And that's all for this section at the moment. Once again, thanks very much for joining us, and goodbye.